Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios, broadcasting as ever from the beautiful beaches of the last free state in America, Florida. Joining me today from all the way around the world in Asia is Joshua Hoffman, who, among other things, is the founder and operator of The Future of Jewish, which I love the name and the project. Josh, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Tell me all. Dive right in. What Future of Jewish? Go.
Yeah, Future of Jewish actually started out as sort of a public research project. In 2022, I read a book um, about the Jewish world, the organized Jewish world, as they call it, that really worried me. Talked about a lot of different trends and data points that were not going in the right direction. And so um, at the time, I was running a streaming platform that I founded called Izzy, an Israeli streaming platform. And when I read the book, I realized that, you know, there's a whole Jewish world out there that Izzy was not going after. I mean, Izzy was sort of the Israel lens,
Hmm.
but I wanted to learn more about the whole Jewish world, not just sort of the capital of Judaism in Israel. So I did this public research project on my own volition and decided to sort of live blog about it as I was doing it, talking to different folks around the world, rabbis, community leaders, thought leaders, influencers, um, different organized, Jewish organized world folks. And I would just kind of share my insights and the conversations that I was having on this website that I started called Future of Jewish.
Hmm.
Since then, it's really evolved into a few different things, but the most recent iteration is a lot of coverage of the Israel-Hamas war since October 7th. I've been doing a lot of original writing, and more recently I've brought in some guest writers, and we're just trying to bring a different, hopefully a little bit more fresh, deeper, more contextualized, more nuanced perspective, not just of the current war, but also the historical relevance and significance that I think is often missing in different places like mainstream media and short form social media.
Brilliant. That's huge. What were the I love the impetus. What was the original thing that really kicked you off as to like, wow, this is a very different perspective on the Jewish community in general from where you're sitting in Israel? What was the kind of main impetus of like, here's where the panoply of diversity comes from, and we're going to start here.
Yeah, I think the first thing, running this streaming platform, which is effectively a tech company, was a focus on innovation, technology-driven innovation, which is really lacking in the Jewish world, whether it's apps, whether it's um, different pieces of software that can enhance the Jewish experience for people, can personalize the Jewish experience for people, can give
Hmm.
people access to parts of the Jewish world and parts of Israel that maybe they're not getting in other places.
Hmm.
So, for us, it was trying to, I ended up writing a book called The Future of Jewish, which talks a lot about sort of how to innovate in the Jewish world. Um, but like I said, when the war broke out, we sort of detoured because, the circumstances called for it.
Sure. Well, this is an existential fight. I mean, from the perspective here, it looks like October 8th and 9th, they gave a couple interviews that from my perspective, I do a lot of national security stuff. It just looked like the Iranians had lost their minds and the Saudis and Israelis were finally going to make peace. They just couldn't take it. And that was kind of the big picture impetus for this. I'm curious to hear about what it's like in Israel on the ground now, because if you're looking at 30,000 square, 30,000 feet, we're in the early days of World War III. It's just going to get worse. I mean, what's the perception? What's it like there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some of that. It's all speculation. There's a few different angles. So there's sort of the Iranian angle. Then there's, I guess, what you're talking about, which is World War III, which is sort of the Russian, Iranian, Chinese axis. So, I think there's that. I think one of the more interesting ones that people are not talking about is actually the Qataris.
Yeah.
I mean, people are talking about the Qataris, but I don't know if they're talking about it through the lens that it should be. I mean, the Qataris effectively started the Syrian civil war.
Yeah.
Um, they funded and armed the rebels that went after Assad, and because Assad didn't want to build a pipeline for natural gas and other resources that the Qataris wanted them to build that would eventually go from the Middle East to Europe. So they basically, started that civil war in Syria, the Qataris did. And I think they're a very nefarious actor. I think that it's been well documented since October 7th how much money they've given to
Oh,
US universities and
yeah.
to think tanks and a lot of different types of influential
They bought Al
aspects
Gore's
of,
TV media network from him. But
right. They
I
buy it.
worked in Doha for a while. Sadly, I helped restructure the Doha securities market into the Qatar exchange. So I spent time there, and people don't pay any attention to them, but they're kind of more radically fundamentalist than the Saudis, the Saudi right wing are.
Yeah, and they're definitely
And
more,
no one
and
pays
they're,
any
yeah, I mean,
attention
I
to
think
them.
their collaboration or their cooperation with Hamas is a perfect fit, so to speak. So I think that's also an angle that I think people should focus more on in terms of, they're a very small country. They have like 300,000 citizens only. They have a few million residents, but in terms of actual Qatari
Yeah.
citizens, it's like 300,000. But they control, the biggest oil field effectively in the world. They share it with the Iranians, and they seem to be some something that people should pay more attention to.
Oh, they irritated their own Sunni brothers. Supposedly, they cut off the bridge to Bahrain a few years ago over some arcane religious dispute that the rest of the world paid no attention to.
Yeah.
Because in Manama they loved them, right? The Qataris would come across the bridge every Saturday, and they'd spend a huge amount of money and drink a lot of whiskey and bet a lot of whores, and then they'd go back and be virtuous for another 5 days. So a lot of young men were very disappointed when when they were no longer allowed to go to Bahrain for a while. Yeah, they're awful. There's no question about it. It's good you raised that because so much is focused on the Gazan government, which I'm sorry, I refuse to call Hamas. They are the government. So I don't know. No one says we're going to a war with Democrats. You say you're going to war with the United States. So right now they're the government. Um, yeah, and they fund them entirely. You got 7 or 8 of those clowns living the high life in 5-star hotels in Doha. Well, they use their people as human shields, and yet you got the useful idiots in America marching on behalf of Hamas. It blows my mind. It has been all I have been writing and talking about since October 7th is that. That's my fight here in America, is to call out every single one of these Jew haters and make them unemployable forever. So it's a project. Uh, um, but it's a somewhat of a punitive project. And I love the idea of building up something more positive as a counterpoint to those of us who are more inclined to go after the evil and smash them. That's great. There's a role. But then there's also a role for those people who are not so inclined, but who are looking for, how do you bolster the sense of Jewish pride, and how do you fight back positively if you're just, a kid in a college campus? And I think part of what you guys are doing is really helpful for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, I think it's a two-sided coin. I mean, I think right now is not a time to necessarily be hopeful for the sake of being hopeful. I mean, there are bits and pieces of hope that exist in Israeli society and that exist in the Jewish world, and it's great to call those out and highlight those. But I think, especially Jews in America, me being a Jewish American that moved to Israel, um, I see a lot of my peers and even family members and friends that I grew up with, Jewish Americans, and it seems to me that the idea that all is good and well and everything's going to work out just because we say it, I think that needs to go away because in Israel that doesn't exist. I mean, Israelis are resilient and hope oriented and optimistic, but there are those things because they acted in those ways to feel those feelings in a sort of authentic way. I think in America, there's this like bumper sticker type society where people just say things because they sound good, but they don't actually mean anything and they don't do anything
Right.
to mean anything. And so I think Americans, and maybe other Jews around the world, maybe Australian Jews, maybe South African Jews, really need to look themselves in the mirror and say, how can we do better, act better, be a little bit more united, a little bit less judgmental. I think that's another big issue in the diaspora, is sort of judging other Jews that are not like you, that don't look like you, that don't live like you, etc.
Hmm.
And realizing that maybe some of the so-called alliances and supporters and collaborators that we've had in the past are not really those things, and that um, the only, I don't want to say the only, but the predominant collaborator, the predominant ally for a Jew is a fellow Jew. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And so it's great to have alliances, and it's great to, help other causes, but at the end of the day, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. I don't think I need to say it. I think it's pretty obvious that the Jews are sort of in a category of our own, and it's up to us to make sure that that space is welcoming, is diverse, is pluralistic, but ultimately is unified.
It's a powerful point, and one that I know that more sort of I'm going to say more indigenously left leaning American Jews that I know, who also haven't traveled a lot, right? So a lot of it comes down to, I've lived and worked in Arab societies for years, from Morocco to Saudi to Qatar to Dubai. So I've got a bit more of a sense. Um, but there's this disappointment, and a friend of mine put it very well. Traditional New York liberal Jew, right? Always has been very much on the side of every sort of socially engaging issue. Was highly supportive of Black Lives Matter in 2020, right? All that sort of general sort of left leaning stuff. And the sense that she said she feels massive kind of disappointment and disillusionment to find out what many of us already knew: the UN is a cesspool of Jew hatred, period, right? Like, and if you don't pay attention and you like the idea of the UN, well, it's very different than the actuality of the UN. So that's what I think a lot of folks I've spoken to are experiencing in the US, is like, wow, we really are alone. This is who we can depend upon. And the fact that the BLM organizers put up posters using the graphic of the Hamas paragliders into the Nova Festival by October 10th, I think blew a lot of sort of liberals away. Like, are you kidding me? I've been marching against police brutality with you for 3 years, and you instantly side on behalf of maniacs who decided to kill people in a festival. That was kind of a big shock, I think. Um, but from your perspective, or the Israeli perspective, obviously nothing is very clear. No, there's no war over until it's done. Is there a good sense that, however awful this is, there's an end in sight, or is there real fear that this can go either way, and this is not done until it's done?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on who you ask. I think Israelis that live on the northern border or close to it, and on the Gaza border or close to it, I think that fear is still very much there, obviously, understandably so. I think Israelis, I mean, I know people that live in Tel Aviv, for example, that are kind of tired of the war. And I live in Tel Aviv as well, but I always remind them, like, yeah, it's easy to be tired of the war when you live in sort of the greatest buffer zone between the north and Gaza. So it's like, you know, I just find that some people in general, not just in Israel, just the lack of empathy, right? Like, just because you're not on the front lines, you know, or for example, people, Israelis that don't have somebody that is in the army or is in reserves, it's like it's as if they're living like a different life, and I
Mhm.
find that to be empathetically lazy. Um, I think that any Israeli and any Jew that doesn't understand that this is an existential war, I think needs to wake up. And you know, I I'm tired of the war too, don't get me wrong. I mean, it's exhausting.
Yep.
It's changed my life, it's changed my, you know, created depression and stress. And but at the end of the day, like it is what it is. I mean, what I try to do, um, you know, when I'm having difficult times over, you know, since October 7th is, you know, I get in a bad mood or I feel bad or whatever, and I just remind myself like I'm not one of the hostages, and like
Right.
immediately I snap out of it. So, you know, I think that, um, yeah, I think in Israel, like it really just depends on where you're living in the country. Although I will say that so where it gets kind of in the gray area is when some Israelis start conflating the Israeli government, which they were protesting before the war, um, to this war. And I think that's also an intellectually lazy viewpoint.
Mm.
I don't love the government either. I didn't vote for the government. But for me, it's very clear, like one thing after the other, meaning let's win the war and then deal with the government if that's what
Right. That would
majority
seem
of
to
people
be
want
the
to do.
important priority.
Right. Not let's not conflate the two
Right.
and try to combine them to advance. Even some of the hostage families have said, um, that, you know, now they're trying to use the hostages as that the families themselves are trying to, you know, conflate some political agenda with the hostages. And I just find that to be, you know, discouraging and misguided. And I think people just have to have that sober look in the mirror and say, okay, first of all, we need to acknowledge the magnitude of the war. Second, we need to win the war. Then third comes everything else. Part of winning the war, you know, in my estimation, is trying to bring back as many of the remaining living hostages as possible. Um, you know, I don't have the intelligence. I don't know how realistic that is. It's also one of a lot of Israelis, for example, they try to put themselves in the shoes of Hamas and like try to think like, what are they thinking? And you just can't do that.
You can. No,
So I
you have no
don't play that
idea
game
how
anymore either. Like,
evil.
well, you know, if we do this, they do that. Like, it's not,
Yeah.
yeah, there's no equivalence. So that's sort of the, you know, the psychoanalysis of what different Israelis are thinking and doing right now.
I get it. It's hard. I mean, it's here in the States because it's such a much larger population. The only 7% of Americans are either serve in the military or know someone who serves in the military,
Yeah,
which
makes
is
sense.
kind of incredible. Um, but I serve on the board of a special operations foundation. I do a lot with the military, always have, and so it's war is always abstract when you're not on the front line. Period. That's partially that's helpful, right? Because that's why militaries rotate soldiers out of the front line because after there's some huge longitudinal studies, like after 48 days of continued combat, 98% or exposure to combat, 98% of people are basically shattered, like just it was called shell shocked. Now it's PTS. A small point, I joined with a psychiatrist I work with. I don't call it PTSD and neither does he, because if you go through that amount of stress, it's not a fucking disorder. It's natural for any human being, right? It's
For sure.
post-traumatic stress. It's not a disorder. That makes it sound like that there's something wrong with these people. There's nothing wrong with you if you've been through that. Small point, but important. Um, that's fascinating to see that even within the small confines of Israel, and there were a couple of mothers who had lost people at the Nova Festival. And you're never going to address a family's grief. I mean, that's part of the awful part of war, right? But you can't. You also want to be the person arguing with grieving families who are desperately trying to get their loved ones back from a horrible hostage situations where they've been taken hostage by human demons. Um, but it isn't helpful, right? And the Arab world doesn't understand the democratic world. They just don't. And so they see as weakness what we see as strength. The ability to yell at your prime minister, the ability to yell at your president is a strength, not a weakness of both Israeli society and American society. But
Right.
our enemies don't see it that way. they see it as, look, we found a fracture and we can exploit it. And I don't think there's any way around that. We're not going to give up our freedoms, right?
Yeah,
But
I mean, I think the only thing that I can understand from some of this is like people are upset that Netanyahu hasn't taken responsibility. And I agree. I mean, I think it's it's one of those things where I learned early on that there's a difference between blame and responsibility. Um, so you can blame whoever you want to blame, but at the end of the day, yeah, the head of anything, whether it's a company or an
yeah,
organization or a
you're on the
city or a
hook for
state,
it.
you're on the hook. That's what you sign up for, by the way. I mean,
Yeah. So
you
he
know,
hasn't, that's a
so
nuance I didn't get. So he hasn't said our
yeah,
fault.
he hasn't taken any, he hasn't said it happened on my watch, it's my responsibility. And by the way, when you take responsibility, I think the difference between blame and responsibility is blame is you're looking back and you're saying what went wrong. Um, Responsibility is saying, how can we correct moving forward? And I think that a lot of Israelis are upset about that, and I understand that.
Hmm.
And I think that a lot of Israelis are saying, well, actually, your policies, Netanyahu and even some of the right-wing factions actually kind of led to this. Now, that's some of that, I think, for example, the idea that, or not the idea, but the reality that Netanyahu said on multiple occasions that he wants to strengthen Hamas to create, um, a division between Fatah and the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinians in Gaza with Hamas. Like that was sort of part of his doctrine. And
That's an odd doctrine. I was, because again, not being
well, I don't know. So there's like a second layer to that, which is did what not the what. A lot of people focus on the what. Like, okay, so that was what he did. That was his doctrine. But what's the why? And
right.
that's what I would want to ask him, for example, like, okay, this is why you know what you did, but why did you think that was the right strategy? Because Netanyahu,
Hmm.
and I never voted for him. I'm not a fan, but I've studied his history as a politician. I mean, he's pretty down the middle. I mean, he's a little right leaning in some ways, but in Israel, you kind of have to be, frankly.
Yep.
But he's like not staunch right wing. I mean, he's a very pragmatic. Um, I think maybe not with the new government that he formed, but previously, I think he was
Yeah.
pretty
I know
down the
one of
middle.
his
So
advisors. They're pretty. They don't seem nuts at all. They just seem kind of like, let's run this country. Let's do the best thing.
yeah, so I think, but some Israelis are upset that he hasn't taken responsibility, and but again, like it's like, okay, so he takes responsibility. Like,
Yeah, but how
what's he
much of
gonna
that
do
is
these days?
politics? So I can't judge it because I'm not there, right? But how much of that is politics? It's like in the U.S. where, one side or the other says, "Well, you haven't said it's your fault." He's like, "I'm fighting a war. What do you want out of my life?" I'm not there, so I don't know. But like, how much of
But it's
that
also
is
like, what's that going to change? Like, it's not going to
what's
change
it going to
anything
change?
if he does or doesn't say two sentences. Um, I think that he is good in a lot of ways for being able to push back against international pressure. Um, and I think like that would just be my message to people outside of Israel that are watching the political circles in Israel,
Mm,
is like it's not binary, like all good or all bad. It's
no,
like Netanyahu, like every politician, has made mistakes, but I think he's also uniquely qualified right now to be managing this war. When I say uniquely qualified, I'm not talking about like him compared to perfection. I'm talking about him compared to the other
the other
political
options,
figures. And I don't
right?
and I don't look at any of the other political figures right now and say I would feel more comfortable with them at the wheel,
That's
frankly.
interesting.
So, I think people have to realize that
And that's coming from someone who you say you are particularly a fan of his. You didn't vote for him in the election.
never voted for
Right
him.
now, for what's happening right now, good news, he's in charge compared to the options.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would call it good news, but
Better news than not. It's relative. All
yeah.
right. Huh. What's the biggest thing you think that non-Israelis are missing in terms of whether the war or what are the big gaps when when you speak to Americans or Australians? What is it that we're not getting that we should get?
I think history. I mean, I think, some people do know a little bit about the Israeli-Palestinian history, but I think most people don't, like they don't go far enough back.
Hmm.
A lot of people talk about 1967. A lot of people talk about the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the Oslo Accords in the 90s. Um, I think you got to go back to the 1830s, frankly,
Just
to really
curious. They
understand.
usually start to pound on people around 1947 and the choice to choose hate over reconciliation, but you'd go back to the 1830s. What?
Well, in 1834, there was something called the Peasant Revolt,
Hmm.
which is when local Arabs who likely did not refer to themselves as Palestinians at the time,
That came later.
um, they rose up against Egyptian conscription law that was trying to be applied to them by the Egyptians.
Right.
And so, as part of this peasant revolt, these what would become Palestinians, these Arabs, in Ottoman era Palestine, decided to go into Jewish communities in Tzfat, in a few other places, and basically do October 7th in 1834.
Because they were
And
mad at the Egyptian army.
1834, what's that?
Because they were mad at the Egyptian army.
Exactly.
Their
And
first
so,
their first reaction is to go kill Jews.
exactly. So I think that's very telling
Hmm.
because one, political Zionism literally didn't exist. The
Right.
Jews that were living in Ottoman era Palestine were primarily the very religious Jews. I mean, Sfat is one of the four holy cities, and Jews have always maintained a minority presence in the Levant
Hmm.
since the Second Temple period. So there was no political movement known as Zionism in 1834. There was no Zionist land acquisitions happening. There was nothing.
Right.
Yet these eventual Palestinians attack Jews for something that has nothing to do with the Jews. And I think that's what most people abroad don't really understand is that this is not a land dispute. This is not, a human rights dispute, a political dispute. This is a ethno-religious war.
Period.
Um, and when you are able to understand the current war and the greater Israeli-Palestinian conflict through that lens, ethno-religious, everything changes. Basically, it's a zero-sum game. It's either us or you or
Right.
us. And the Israelis don't, the mainstream sort of Israelis don't look at it like that. Some Israelis do, by the way, and I don't necessarily align with them. But I would say the majority of Israelis are very much or were very much for a two-state solution. Um, over the course of this conflict, things changed, and some
Right.
Israelis became more conservative because of, for example, the Second Intifada and the failed Oslo Accords. Um,
And they have proven they don't want a two-state solution. They want to wipe Israel off the map.
right. But the Palestinians, by and large, right? I mean, I'm not talking about, 100%, but yeah, a majority of them have never been for a two-state solution, have never really been willing to compromise. They've had multiple two-state solution proposals on the table that they've either ignored or walked away from, or found a way to, come up with an excuse or a reason for not moving forward in that direction.
Yep.
And that's what more people should realize is this is an ethno-religious conflict that cannot be resolved in the way that most Western minds work. So
No,
if you're
that
trying to apply Western
I'm
conventional
glad you
wisdom
put
to,
it that way because
yeah,
when I'm speaking with people about this, you got to understand, land for peace was a Western construct. No one on
exactly,
the Palestinian side, PLO, ever accepted that. They used it as a bargaining chip to move forward, but they never believed it. You kept giving them
exactly,
land, they didn't give peace in return.
exactly. So, I think, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, which is a great Israeli historian and the father of Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu, he talked about that there is no real solution to the conflict. It's basically incumbent on Israel to have very strong deterrence and from time to time um, be willing and able to tolerate some terrorism. Definitely not what happened on October 7th,
Sure.
but you know, the idea that there's going to be terrorism from time to time, but if we're vigilant and smart, strategic, and even able to work with, some of the other Arab countries that we do have peace with to minimize the effects of that terrorism, that's as good as you're going to get. And, I think that's kind of where I'm at too. I don't
Mm.
see the solution unless, of course, there's a radical uh, change in the Palestinian psyche, which, could happen, I guess. But what we know today, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Wow. Well, for what it's worth, I'll give you a bit of a glimmer of hope in that, right? The who was it? It wasn't Ben Gurion. Who was it? Sharon was arguing. Basically, you don't negotiate with your friends, right? You by definition you negotiate with people who hate you, right? That's the point, right? So someone was asking him about like, are these current negotiations going well, and are they friendly? He said, what's friendly? They hate us. They want to kill us. No, we're negotiating with enemies. I'm blanking who that was. It might have been Diane. Anyway, the only glimmer of hope that I see, having spent a lot of time working in the Arab world, is that the younger generation, I'm in my 50s, right? The younger generation on down is largely tired of this crap, right? And that's part of why the Abraham Accords had fertile ground, is that, you've moved to Israel, but you've got, think of the time at NYU or any of the universities where folks from both Israel and the GCC countries are gone to college together. Like a lot of this, I think, at least my impression is that if there is an end to this, right? Gaza should be a paradise, right? Beirut should be a paradise. Should go back to being a paradise. And this eternal hatred, eventually, it has to come from within Palestinian society. And the only people that can help them with that, frankly, are their Arab brothers. Like, they're not going to listen to me. I'm going to
But
listen to you.
there's no such thing as Arab brothers. I mean,
But they're.
that's
I
a
agree
failed
with that.
concept. That's a illusionary concept. I mean, every Arab state does what's best for every Arab state,
Yes,
and
but
that's
I
how it's
want
always
you to.
been.
If that's true, then this is forever, and this war will never fucking end, right? The only hope I see is that it becomes like Europe, where there are eternal hatreds there too, but they eventually got tired of it. And there was a Marshall Plan. Still, it still didn't work, right? Still, they're still fighting each other there. But that's the only hope I see, is that there's more money to be made in running resorts in Gaza where you're charging Israelis $17 for an alcohol-free mojito on the beach than there is in teaching your kids to go kill them. That's the only hope, and it's got to come from them. I don't know if it will. No idea, right? But that's the only hope I
Yeah, I mean,
see.
I just don't. I mean, yeah, that's like a very Western, like, let's start a bunch of casinos and hotels. Like, I mean, Dubai did some of that, but they're the exception to the rule. I mean,
Yeah,
there's only one Dubai in the Middle East. Yeah,
and it's still not perfect.
I just, again, it's hard. It's
They have to get tired of this crap. It has to be them. It's not going to be the Israelis.
yeah, but I think it's a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, I think it's hard to get out of the loop. I mean, the loop right now is start a war, if you're the Palestinians, start a war, lose, and then cry about it. And then
Yeah,
that loop just, feel bad, hate more. I mean,
sure.
so I don't, it's not a question of let's give them more land, give them more
No,
money,
no,
give
no.
them
Don't
more
give them anything.
opportunities. Like
They
that
have to
doesn't work.
want to stop, right? That was Golda Meir's point.
Well, I mean, there's two ways to look at it. There's, sort of that wishful thinking that you're sort of describing,
Yep,
or there's harsh penalties for continuing to behave the way they do.
yep,
And when I say harsh penalties, I mean, again, I'm not, a government strategist or a military strategist, but to me, it's got to be, you know, you hurt us, we're going to hurt you 10 times as much.
yeah,
And if you
yep,
don't like it, then leave
yeah. And that's the status quo.
or stop. I mean, those are the two
Or
options,
stop.
or stop doing this
Eventually, it's bad enough where someone's
or
like, why
leave
do we
because
keep doing this?
or die. I mean, those are the three options.
Yeah,
Stop doing it, leave the region because it's not good for you, or die. because you pick a fight that you can't win, and that might be, I'm not coming from a place that I want to expel the Palestinians, or that I want to take their land. It's just very clear to me that, like, you start a fight. I'm not a fighter. I'm like a very, I've like never gotten into a fight in my life. But if somebody's gonna punch me in the face, I mean, I'm gonna probably stand up for myself. So that's all Israel is doing.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's all the Jews in the region have ever done. I mean,
Right.
yeah, you have a few hundred, very small minority of violent Israelis that you have in every country, by the way.
Sure.
But the vast majority of Israelis are like, I want to wake up, go to work, have a family. I want my kids to be educated. I want my kids to travel the world. I want to travel the world. Um, that's sort of mainstream Israel, and that's why I think, yeah, the deterrence there, we have to, part of this war, I think, is restoring that deterrence, which right now is the physical deterrence, but then having the lasting effect of that, where that has to stay in the back of the Palestinians' mind, of Hezbollah's mind, and any other group that thinks about inflicting harm on Israel. Because if we don't do that, then it's just an open invitation to,
Over and over again.
yeah.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. So, not switching gears, but come right back around. So your project, what would you suggest is most useful or most effective for you started this project, Future of Jewish, part of your own journey, right? What would you be suggesting to folks um, that they learn more about, that they focus more about?
About future of Jewish?
Yeah, about you're a random secular Jew in Sydney or New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, and you kind of you could certainly go hop down Chabad. They're happy to talk to you, but that's all about the religion. But just in general, um, what
Yeah,
is
I
what
think,
sort of interesting things you would suggest that people take the time to learn that it's a very heterogeneous community, oddly, because it's small, but what would you suggest people kind of focus on or try to broaden their minds about?
I think, when I started this research project that I mentioned, what I discovered for myself is that Judaism it's kind of like a buffet that has something for everyone. And so some people like the religious and the spiritual aspects, and some people like the history, and some people like, the Zionist aspect, and some people like the Jewish tourism, which obviously is very prominent in Israel, but Jewish tourism, all over Europe, and uh, all different places in the world, even. Um, I think Judaism has something for everyone, and not just for Jews, by the way, for anyone, Jewish philosophy, for example, the Jewish moral code, uh, literally endless stuff. And I think that a lot of people look for those things in other places, um, whether it's other religions or other cultures, other places, physical places. And I think that, you know, if more people also, not only, but also looked for whatever, whether it's philosophy or self-help or history, tourism, if they also looked for those things in Judaism, it would be
Hmm.
good for them because they would find great, appealing, interesting nuggets. But it would also be good for the Jewish world because more people would learn about it, more people could speak about it, more people could even add to it. I think if you look at Jewish history, it's kind of been an evolution. It's not like, I mean, some of the things from the very beginning are still true today, but a lot of things have evolved.
Hmm.
So I think the more people that plug into it, the more people that can contribute to it in different ways, which I think is important. Um, and I think that, um, you know, if we're able to create that sort of two-way street where more people plugging in, more people contributing, Judaism adding more values to people's lives in different ways, I think that's like the best way to fight anti-Semitism and Jew hatred and anti-Israel and anti-Zionism. Like, there's no, I mean, people have been spending probably in the billions of dollars on like fighting anti-Semitism. Like, it's just not working. Like, let's just.
No, no.
So I think, like, to create that loop, um, that I just described, I think is great. You know, it's a win-win-win. It's a win for Judaism. It's a win for the people that plug into it and contribute to it, and it's a win for um, hopefully getting to a place where Jew hatred and anti-Semitism is not having the kind of impact that we're seeing today.
An optimistic view, a good one, because yeah, it is the never-ending hatred. And George Gilder writes about it beautifully. Ever read the Israel Test?
I have not.
It's good, but he describes it well because a lot of folks, especially I've been writing about this for years, but a lot of folks are baffled by this eruption since October 7th in America, especially on universities. Um, the main problem is that leftists, and you go back to Karl Marx, one of the world's original self-hating Jews, that all of the left's focus is on groups, group identity, group guilt. Everything's broken into groups. They don't. But you go back to Judaism, the Ten Commandments are the origin of individual rights and responsibilities. And whether people know it consciously or not, the conflation between Marxism on U.S. campuses and Jew hatred is tight because of that, because
That's right.
Israel represents the ultimate in personal responsibility, whether they process it consciously or not. You got 850,000 Jews were thrown out of Arab countries between 48 and 68. Did the UN create a perpetual bureaucracy to help them? No. They lost all their shit. They started again and they created a society, right? It's what we do everywhere in the world. And people who are failing in their own lives don't ever want to say I'm failing because I'm inadequate. I haven't worked hard enough. I'm a loser. No, 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 no. There must be someone else to blame for this. Well, why don't I
Right.
choose someone successful? And that, oddly, much like the Palestinian theoretically having to change gears internally, every Jew hater in the world, that's an internal job that's got nothing to do with us. And it is frustrating because the go-to assumption on behalf of Jews in general, I think, is more education leads to more enlightenment. But there were Nazis in Germany with 3 PhDs who spoke 6 languages, so it's not education; it's a mindset. So to the extent that's helpful, I love what you're doing, and it provides everyone a chance to take a look and give some thought, Jewish, not Jewish. And so here's to the future of Jewish. And I'm glad you were able to come on and talk about it. Any last brilliant pearl of wisdom to leave? No pressure.
No, I think I've said enough.
Excellent. Well, I thanks so much for coming on, Josh, and to my usual listeners. Just remember the mainstream media is lying to you. Save your brains, turn it off, and tune into messy times.